Hello, welcome to What Catholics Believe. This special program is prompted by an article that appeared on LifeSiteNews.com, dated Monday, July 9th, 2018, under the News section, Catholic Church, Demographics. The article is entitled Former Vatican Bank Chief, Authors of New World Order Demographic Collapse Influencing the Vatican. Now, this is a very interesting article, and it's not only interesting because of what it says, but because of the fact that it is being said by a certain Ettore Gotti Tedeschi. Signor Tedeschi was the former head of the Vatican Bank. So he was on staff in the Vatican, and he's talking about developments in the Vatican right now that are so troubling to him that he warns that it could have and will have catastrophic consequences. And because of the gravity of the events that he's talking about, because of the seriousness of his presentation, I thought it would be good to read you the article word for word from LifeSiteNews. And this is dated Rome, July 7th, 2018, actually. July 7th, 2018, Rome, LifeSiteNews. Now, I just want to point out here that Signor Tedeschi was talking at the John Paul II Academy for Human Life and the Family. And there's a certain amount of irony to this because, of course, John Paul II, a post-Vatican II Pope of the Novus Ordo, certainly contributed his part to the destruction and the attack on the family. His World Youth Days attracted thousands and thousands of young people to what have come to be called Catholic Woodstocks, certainly not exactly family-friendly. And so I say there's a certain amount of irony that he is delivering this as a talk at the Human Life Conference at the John Paul II Academy for Human Life and the Family. This conference was dated May 21st, actually, 2018. The conference was at the Hotel Il Cantico at the Via del Cotolengo in Rome. And it was a conference dedicated to the matter of, well, as they say, human life, the family, the splendor of truth, the gifts of God. And you'll understand why Signor Tedeschi is so concerned when I read you the article. His own conference was entitled The Rejection of Life, a Democratic Catastrophe for Mankind. And so I'll begin reading the article from LifeSiteNews, datelined Rome, July 7, 2018. The demographic collapse of the West in recent decades was planned in order to create the necessary conditions to usher in a new world order. And the authors of this collapse are now influencing the Vatican at the highest levels. The former president of the Vatican Bank has said, speaking at the first international conference of the John Paul II Academy for Human Life and the Family, Italian economist and banker Ettore Gotti Tedeschi said efforts to decrease the world's population by globalist elites have set in motion a series of predictable and intended economic, geopolitical, and social catastrophes meant to, quote, persuade people around the world to accept a global, quote, political vision that would eliminate national sovereignty and institute, quote, Gnostic environmentalism and its, quote, universal religion. The recurrent themes of the present papacy are poverty, immigration, and the environment. And we are led to believe that these are caused by the greed of bankers. War and man, the cancer of nature, he said. But this is fake news, quote unquote, according to Gotti Tedeschi. For him, the cause behind all of these scourges is the, quote, collapse in births, unquote. The people pushing this fake news, he said, are, quote, Gnostic prophets, such as population control proponents Paul Ehrlich, Jeffrey Sachs, and Ban Ki-moon, who, rejecting the natural law and the divine order of creation, seek to proselytize the world with their anti-Catholic gnosis. According to Gotti Tedeschi, the greatest enemy of the New World Order is the family, because it provides, quote, education, autonomy, and independence from the state. Its second enemy is the Catholic Church, he said, and yet these Gnostic prophets are, quote, rewriting Genesis in the halls of the Vatican. It was planned. The democratic collapse was planned without any doubt, Gotti Tedeschi said. It is unthinkable that the decision makers in the United States and around the world did not know what they would have created by refusing life and the natural law. The Italian financier said the economic collapse has been caused by a collapse in births, not because couples are having no children, but because they are not having enough to provide economic growth. Quote, zero growth is 2 children for a couple, he said. Zero growth is substitution, with the consequences that the GDP stops growing. Governments have solved this problem by increasing consumerism and outsourcing production, primarily to Asia. But as the demographic collapse results in an ever larger aging population, so governments must increase taxes to absorb the costs of those living in retirement, he explained, resulting in a crippling effect on GDP, that's the gross domestic product, of course, and the nation's economies. It can appear to grow, but it is a big bluff invented in the last 30 years, he said. Gotti Tedeschi believes that none of this has happened by chance, and that the decrease in population was needed in order to produce a crisis in the global economy, and so make it easier to usher in a new world order. Economy is a formidable means of persuasion, he said. It is the best excuse to make people around the world accept a conclusion. He referred to the Kissinger report, which he said was partly an attempt to homogenize culture by relativizing religion and, if possible, creating religious syncretism. This goal is helped by immigration, leading to a potentially dangerous mix of religious dogmas that could cause war. The population control movement in the United States dates back to the pro-Nazi, pro-eugenics founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. In 1969, President Richard Nixon criticized population growth in the Third World, a problem later addressed by the Commission on Population Growth and the American Future in 1972, directed by John D. Rockefeller III. At the time, American geostrategists thought that population control in the Third World was a threat to American international interests. This led to the National Security Study Memorandum 200, NSSM 200, published by Henry Kissinger 2 years later in 1974. The 200-page report specifically states that population growth in the Third World is a threat to American international interests because the growing populations need too many resources and the Western industrial system, for example, needs the resources of Africa. The report also called for increased funding to be given to Planned Parenthood. Quote, everything was planned, Gotti Tedeschi believes, lamenting the fact that documents such as the Kissinger report have largely not been read. He said that the threat of environmental catastrophe, which he calls fake news, is now used to push for a reduction in the population gap between East and West. Not only that, but the growing gap between too many rich and old people and too many young who are unemployed is used to create the spirit for accepting euthanasia. Such a mentality is criminal, he said, as he recalled Italy's prime minister, he didn't say which, telling him one could cut the cost of government expenditure in 1 second through euthanasia, which would cut 25% of the population over 60 years old. Gotti Tedeschi also drew attention to the current tension between globalism and nationalism. Those who wished for a Europe that helps single countries grow as opposed to globalists who would prefer a Europe that governs all countries and eliminates national sovereignty. So what can the church do? The church will either collide or be isolated, he said. But something has happened that should worry a lot of people, he added, referring to recent actions taken, in particular, by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Those currently advising the, quote, top of the church, unquote, he observed, are population control advocates such as Paul Ehrlich, Jeffrey Sachs, and the former UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, people he calls Gnostic prophets. To transform the divine Genesis into a Gnostic Genesis, and to do this at the Pontifical Academy inside the Vatican, would be their, quote, masterpiece, he said. We are near to this happening, he added. This should worry everyone. Now, these statements by the former head of the Vatican Bank are extremely revealing. Not that to those who are paying attention and have been paying attention for some time, not that they are revealing anything we don't already know. The fact that they're being said, and they're being said by a man like this, who is very prominent in the Vatican, should be really noteworthy for everyone. Now, if I can just make a few comments on this to bring it into focus for those who might not have followed exactly clearly. This was not his speech, but this was an article in LifeSiteNews about his speech. So it might be worth commenting. Notice what this former president of the Vatican Bank and an economist is saying. He's saying about the economy. He's saying about the world economy. And he's saying this about what he calls fake news. He's saying that we are being told that the problem with the world economy is caused by the greed of bankers, being caused by war, being caused by man, as though we are the cancer of nature. He says that's not true. He says the problem with the world economy is caused by the lack of growth of population. Exactly the opposite. What the zero population growth and the negative population growth want you to know, want you to think anyway. They want you to think overpopulation is a problem. He says the problem is we're not growing the population in the world. As though the economy will grow with the population. The economy will grow with the work and the workers who are there, who are producing. He says this is really the cause. All of these scourges, what he calls the collapse in births. And he says the fake news, not that this is just a lie, it is a lie that is not just contrary to the truth, it is a lie that is the exact opposite of the truth. The lie that we need to reduce the world's population in order to gain the control we need, to have the prosperity we need, is the exact opposite of the truth, he says. And he says this lie is being perpetrated, and actually not only being perpetrated, it has been spread by these people like Paul Ehrlich for generations. Well, for at least decades now anyway. But he says that now they are given the platform of the Vatican. They are given the Vatican platform, especially the Pontifical Academy of Sciences now, where these men have been invited by Francis himself to address the world through the Vatican. So Francis has turned the microphone of the Vatican over to these men to bring their negative and zero population growth creeds here, which are causing a catastrophe for mankind, he says. Now, he actually alluded to the war of religion here. He didn't call it a war on religion, but he says this clash of doctrines could lead to war. But one thing that he's not saying is that to give them the pulpit of the Catholic Church to preach their anti-God doctrines, their anti-Christ doctrines, is very worrisome indeed. You can tell this man is very concerned about this. He even says that these men are been called to advise, quote, the top of the church. You know who he's talking about here. You know exactly who he's referring to here. He doesn't name Francis, but he says they're being brought in to talk to those who are in the very top echelons of power in the Novus Ordo Church here. So it's very clear what he's talking about here. He said it's impossible to think that these decision makers don't know what's happening. It's impossible because they've refused life and they're refusing the natural law of God. So he's not talking as a theologian, but he's talking about as an economist. And he's saying as an economist, he knows there's a lie behind all of this. And that what is being perpetrated is fake news, bald-faced lie. The collapse in births, the anti-life doctrines of these men that are now permeating the Vatican is what is causing this disaster. And he says the reason why they are given this platform is because they need it to promote a new world order. They needed the collapse in births to provoke an economic crisis in the world in order to move people to accept the very concept of a new world order. This is the progression that he sees happening here. He says they've used the idea of expanding economies for a while to give the illusion of growth. But he says as long as the population has been in decreasing, the only way they could give that illusion of growth is by expanding consumerism, getting those who are alive, who have incomes, to buy, right? Everything is about the economy. Everything is about buying power. Everything's about your credit rating, etc., etc. He said this can create an illusion of growth. But it says in fact, he says the economies have not been expanding, they've been shrinking. To the point where now the demographics of the world essentially come out that we have an ever-aging population, increasing in numbers relative to the number of young people coming into the world and entering the workforce and actually producing something. So that this is imposing more and more of a burden to care for the elderly, and fewer actually productive workers to do it. And this is going to provide them their argument for euthanasia now. He said this is all planned, all very well thought out, how we're being manipulated, how our minds are being manipulated to accept this new world order of theirs, which is going to be a kind of religion. He says those who are pushing this, and they're pushing it through the Vatican right now, are what he calls the Gnostic prophets. Pagan. But this is a special kind of paganism, Gnosticism. Gnosticism was the idea that the secret knowledge of mankind is that mankind is God, is its own God. That's the fundamental proposition of Gnosticism. And acknowledging that fact is to actually come into our own as the only real divine being there is. And he says the idea of this is to transform the divine Genesis into a Gnostic Genesis, and to promote as a world religion a kind of Gnostic environmentalism. But again, going back to this Gnostic idea that man is God, mankind is God. The whole idea of the New Age movement and all of that is all bound up with this here. He doesn't mention it here, but it certainly plays a very serious part here. So he says, he's referring to the Kissinger report, which actually is an outgrowth of something set in motion by J.D. Rockefeller III in 1972, looking for America's future, saying we need the resources of Africa, and if the population in the third world is going to grow, that's going to use their resources, the resources that we want, and so we have to push this population control in the third world, so that we still have access to these resources. But that's what's capitalized on, according to Gotti Tedeschi, then by Kissinger, who summarized this in a 200-page report in 1974, talking about the growth of population being a threat to us. We have to adopt this program and almost a creed demanding zero population, even negative population growth. We have to cut down the number of people on the face of the earth. Now, when you read these words, you might well think about the Georgia Guidestones. These Georgia Guidestones are a kind of American Stonehenge, they've been called. Enormous granite monoliths that have been erected, 8 of them, I believe, in Georgia. And engraven on them in very large, bold letters are basically the new commandments for the New World Order. And I believe the very first one of them is that the population of the earth must not exceed 500 million people. Now, right now, they say there are about 7 billion people in the world. And they don't explain there in the Georgia Guidestones how they're going to get rid of all of those excess people. But we know war, famine, disease, plague, they have a lot of ways they can eliminate people. They want no more than 500 million people to be allowed to live on the earth. That's what these Georgia Guidestones call for. There are stories about their origins. They were paid for by a very strange, a very mysterious individual who talked to a local marble worker. I think the quarries were involved, the granite quarries were involved there. But he paid for them in cash, as I understand, up front, and did not give his real name. They seem to be traceable to the Rosicrucian Society, though. Certainly, they very well be heavily involved in this. As a secret society, a kind of related Masonic society, you might say, they certainly do have an interest in all of this New World Order. Gotti Tedeschi does not reference them, but he certainly does talk about the program of population control, the zero population growth leading the way to the negative population growth, to cull the herd of mankind, and even talks about one of the great resources that Kissinger mentioned that needed to be funded for this was Planned Parenthood. And that he does mention. Gotti Tedeschi does mention here. So he said the threat of environmental catastrophe, which we're being faced with, climate change, global warming. Remember, Francis watched Ireland vote for abortion, and then watched Argentina vote for abortion. Never said a word about it until after it was taking place already. It was either a done deal or it was already in place. Done in Ireland, in progress in Argentina. Francis did not raise his voice one bit. What was he doing? He was organizing this global conference to discuss climate change. The movers and shakers of the world, the heads of the oil companies and all the rest, invited to the Vatican to have a big conference about climate change and the threat to mankind, the threat to the earth. This is what Francis was doing. And there are those who actually suggest, well, why was he concerned about the climate change thing and organizing this enormous conference in Rome, which has nothing to do with this other issue going on with abortion? Why didn't he leave that off and come and shore up the Catholics in Ireland, what's left of them, and in Argentina, what's left of them, and oppose abortion? Why was he focusing on climate change? Well, the people who are talking like that really don't understand. They need to read this article by Gotti Tedeschi, because he tells them this focus on climate change is all about population control. What happened in Ireland, voting on abortion, was all about population control. What was in progress in Argentina, loosening their abortion laws. It's all about population control. It's just that Francis was organizing for the other side. He's organizing in favor of the population control idea in order to push everyone to the New World Order. So what Francis was organizing in the Vatican, while this was going on in Argentina and Ireland, was not somehow distinct from what was going on in Ireland and Argentina, the push for abortion. It was exactly addressing the very issue of abortion, the very issue of global population control, which is the message of these New World Order Gnostic prophets, Paul Ehrlich, who spoke in the Vatican, Jeffrey Sachs, and the UN General Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, also invited to speak in the Vatican to address the church and the world, the Novus Ordo Church, and a New Order world about the need for population control. Actually, the woman who was in charge of the United Nations Council or Conference or whatever committee for global climate change got up before they was assembled there and said that we need to build the ark. We need to build an ark, as though there's another global catastrophe coming, like the flood. She wasn't actually talking about getting out the planks of wood and building an actual boat. She's talking about building an ark through global control, through global government. That's what she's talking about. Francis is there. He is the one providing the platform for them all. He's the one who's giving the voice and giving it the veneer of religion. Remember in the book of the Apocalypse, it talks about the little beast with the lamb's horn, like this little monster with the lamb's horn, calling everyone to worship the beast, calling everyone to honor the beast and to follow the great beast. Is it possible that this is Francis? Some would say, is it possible at this point that it's not Francis? I don't know. It's not wrong to ask that question, though. It's a question that will have to be asked at some time about someone. So, Gotti Tedeschi says the church either has to collide with this or not, or even be a part of it. The church is going to resist this or promote this. We know what's happening. He's talking about the Novus Ordo Church. Unfortunately, it's the Church of Francis. It's also the Church of Benedict. It's also the Church of John Paul II and Paul VI and John the 23rd. They all called for a world authority to govern the economy of the nations of the world. They wanted a global economy governed by a global authority. They've all called for that. This is no accident. We've seen this happening before our very eyes for well over a generation now, since Vatican II. And now this message is being piped through the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. the idea of the divine genesis of mankind, when God says, increase, multiply, and fill the earth, they've changed the meaning of this. I'm sorry to say, but they have. When God says, be fruitful, increase, multiply, and fill the earth, they have made a caricature of that statement of God. The idea of being fruitful for them has a very different meaning. Do not increase, do not multiply, do not fill the earth. Don't give life. Yes, homosexuality is a very, very big part of their plan. An essential part of their plan to control the world's population by promoting homosexuality. They want to change it into what they call a Gnostic Genesis. That is to say, mankind is God, and mankind must control its own population. By death, by refusing to give life in the first place, and by putting to death those who no longer serve a purpose in this new world order. And Gotti Tedeschi says this. He says that if they can use the Vatican to do this, and as they are using the Pontifical Academy inside the Vatican to do this now, they will consider this to be their quote-unquote masterpiece, he says, their masterwork. It is truly satanic. He says, we are near to this happening, he warns. He said this should worry everyone. So I thought it was worth pointing this out. As I say, the fact that what he's saying is not really news to those who have been aware and following the genesis of this New World Order, but the fact that it's being said now, and being said by a man like this, and in a forum like this, is very interesting. So anyway, I think we have to get back to the fundamental reality of what Our Lady told us at Fatima, that this is the result of sin. That Satan has no power but for the fact that we are willing to give him our attention, we're willing to give him our allegiance, we're willing to obey him, we're willing to make him Lord. After all, your Lord is the one you obey, and if you sin and obey Satan, then he considers it that you are saying that he is your Lord. He considers it to be actually worship of him. Your sins, our sins, he considers to be a form of satanic worship. That's how he takes it. As though we are proclaiming him our Lord and the Lord of mankind by sin. Our Blessed Mother has made it very clear to us that we have to pray very hard, especially the Rosary, but we have to stop sinning. We have to stop offending God by sin. This is what gives Satan power in the world. The fact that we are willing to cooperate with him and willing to hearken to his voice and follow his will by sin. We have to militate against this. Notice how much sin is at the root of this New World Order. The very, you might say, womb of this New World Order is sin. It's what gives it life, such as it has. The beast will be born of sin. So we have to stop sinning. We have to give up our liberalism. We have to convince as many as we can to stop following modernism and go back to practice the traditional Catholic faith and be faithful to Christ. Not just halfway faithful or 75% faithful, not 90% or 99%, but 100% faithful to our Lord, absolutely. Our Lady says that we should consecrate ourselves to her Immaculate Heart in this battle. Because her Immaculate Heart is that model for us, which was not only 99% faithful, but it was absolutely 100% faithful because of her perfect love for God and perfect will, that is the union of her will with his, the uniformity of her will with the will of God, of her heart with the heart of Christ. That is our model. That's what we've got to follow. We've got to consecrate ourselves to her and follow the example that she gave, or rather, consecrate the example that God has given us in her. May God bless you all.